Have you ever really stopped to think about the wiring inside your body? I'm not talking about bones or muscles. I'm talking about that incredibly complex, high-speed data network that is your nervous system. For decades, it was basically this massive, invisible superhighway. Doctors knew it was there, of course, but actually seeing it in detail, that was pure science fiction. Well, today, we're going to dive into the amazing story of how that all changed.
It seems like a pretty straightforward question, right? I mean, we've got all this incredible imaging technology. But here's the thing. Nerves are a unique challenge. They're tiny, for one. They're wrapped up in other tissues. And, most importantly, they're surrounded by things that just shout much, much louder inside an MRI scanner, completely drowning them out.
So here's the roadmap for our journey. We'll start with why seeing nerves is so tough in the first place. Then we'll look at the early attempts and how they finally solved the giant fat problem. After that, we'll get into the incredible leap into 3D, mapping the nerve superhighway itself. And finally, we'll see the amazing toolkit radiologists have at their disposal today.
Okay, let's start with that fundamental challenge. You have to imagine that in an MRI, nerves are like these quiet, faint, gray wires. But they are completely surrounded by tissues, especially fat, that act like blinding neon lights, just totally overwhelming the signal from the nerve itself.
So, where did the solution even begin? Well, it wasn't one single eureka moment. It was more like this slow burn of clever, persistent tinkering by researchers who just refused to believe it was impossible. Now, what's really fascinating here is just how long this journey took. The very first proof-of-concept images, they came way back in 1995 on machines that are, let's be honest, ancient by today's standards. Then it took another 13 years for a really key technique called the Dixon method to even be tested for this. And then in 2015, another huge leap came from creatively hijacking a tool that was meant for the brain. It was a slow, steady grind of innovation.
The single biggest roadblock, the one thing that stood in the way for years, was fat. In an MRI, fat is so incredibly bright that trying to see a nerve right next to it is like trying to spot a faint star right next to a full moon. So job number one was figuring out how to dim that moon.
At first, there were a couple of ways to try and dim that moon. One method, spectral FatSat, was just too finicky. It was unreliable in tricky parts of the body. The real game changer, the first big win, was a technique called STIR. It cleverly uses the unique physics of fat to completely nullify its signal, making it the reliable workhorse of early neurography.
But then came an even more elegant solution, the Dixon method, and this is just pure genius. Instead of just trying to erase the fat signal, the scanner takes two images, one right after the other. Because of how fat and water behave in a magnetic field, their signals get just slightly out of sync, and software can use that tiny difference to perfectly, mathematically, create two completely separate images, one of just the water in your body and one of just the fat. This gives you a flawless, fat-free view of the nerves.
Okay, so we've solved the fat problem. We can finally see the nerves on a single 2D slice. But a nerve isn't just a dot, right? It's a long, winding cable. The next great challenge was to go from taking what's basically a single photograph to building a complete 3D model of a nerve's entire twisting path.
And this is where things get really cool. 3D isotropic imaging. Now, isotropic is just a fancy word that means the pixels, or in 3D they're called voxels, are perfect little cubes. This lets the scanner capture a whole block of the body all at once. Then, after the scan is done, a radiologist can sit down at a computer and just digitally slice through that block in any direction they want, up, down, sideways, or even perfectly along the path of a nerve, all without losing any image quality. No more guessing. It was a total game changer.
One of the cleverest 3D sequences is called Fiesta. It's designed specifically for the spine. And what it does is it makes the cerebrospinal fluid, that's the liquid surrounding your spinal cord, incredibly bright white. And against that brilliant white background, the darker nerve roots coming out of the spine just pop into view in perfect contrast. It's awesome. It basically uses the body's own fluids as a natural contrast agent.
You know, this quote really captures the spirit of this whole story. Progress didn't always come from some brand new purpose-built technology. A lot of the time, it came from pioneers like Eduardo Figueiredo, who looked at a tool designed for one job, in this case, a brain sequence, and thought, I wonder if I can adapt this to solve a totally different problem. It's that kind of resourceful invention that really pushed the field forward.
So far, pretty much everything we've talked about is like creating a really good roadmap. It shows you exactly where the nerves are, but what if you could actually see the traffic moving on that highway? What if you could tell if there was a traffic jam or a road closure ahead? Well, that's the next frontier, seeing not just the nerve, but its function.
And the tool for that is something called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI. Honestly, the best way to think of it is like Google Maps for your nervous system. DTI doesn't actually look at the nerve itself, it tracks the microscopic movement of water molecules. In a healthy nerve, water flows really easily up and down the nerve fiber, just like cars on a highway. So by mapping that flow, DTI can build this incredible 3D picture of all the nerve pathways.
So what does this nerve traffic report actually tell us? Well, first, it maps the exact direction of all the nerve tracks, creating these beautiful 3D maps that are sometimes called cabelinhos, which is Portuguese for little hairs. Second, it can measure the integrity of the nerve. Is the traffic flowing smoothly, all in one direction, or is it chaotic and disorganized, which might suggest there's damage? This allows doctors to spot subtle problems long before the nerve itself even looks physically abnormal on a regular scan.
So let's bring it all together. Radiologists now have this incredible modern toolkit. They can combine all these different methods to get the absolute clearest picture of our nervous system that's ever been possible.
But before we wrap up, I've got one last absolutely brilliant piece of imaging magic for you. And it sounds completely backward. How could you possibly inject something that makes tissues brighter in order to make them disappear from the final image?
It's called the gadolinium stir trick. Remember stir, the sequence that erases fat? Well, it works by nullifying tissues that have a specific physical property, called a short T1 time, and fat just naturally has that. But here's the clever part. It turns out that when muscle absorbs that gadolinium contrast agent, its T1 time also becomes very short. So you inject the contrast, the muscles soak it up, you run a stir sequence, and poof, the stir sequence now sees the muscle as fat-like and erases its signal completely, leaving the nerves behind in just stunning clarity.
And this brings us to today's powerful toolkit. It really is all about choosing the right tool for the job. You want a great general-purpose 3D view? You use CubeStir. You're looking at a complex area? Flex is your go-to for that perfect fat-water separation. And if you need to see not just the anatomy, but the nerve's actual health, that's where DTI comes in. Together, they create this incredibly comprehensive picture. And just how detailed can we get? This number pretty much says it all. Modern sequences can achieve an isotropic resolution of 0.8 millimeters. That is less than the thickness of a credit card. We're talking about a level of detail that lets doctors clearly see unbelievably tiny nerves, like the occipital nerve at the back of your head, nerves that were completely and totally invisible just a few years ago.
Think about it. We've gone from blurry, hopeful proofs of concept to high-resolution 3D functional maps in just a few decades. The progress has been absolutely astounding, and it leaves us with one final fascinating question. For the first time in human history, we have a detailed atlas of our own internal wiring. Now that we can finally see it, how is that going to change our ability to fix it?